Hello everybody and welcome to my YouTube channel, Spiritual Astrology. My name is Mercedes Simon and in this video I want to show you the main astrological factors that could be related to the situation that humanity is facing now with the coronavirus, the health crisis and the economic crisis. In the first part of this video, we are going to look at these astrological factors, which are the eclipses that took place in December and January, also the very powerful conjunction of Saturn and Pluto which happened in January, and also the positions of Uranus in Taurus and Neptune in Pisces. But we must not forget that humanity has gone through many pandemics and crises before. Therefore, in the second part of this video, we are going to look at these critical moments in history, especially in relationship to the Saturn-Pluto cycle, which is also very active now. For example, we can pinpoint the moments of the Black Death or the beginning of the cholera, in which there were Saturn-Pluto conjunctions, as it has happened now in 2020. After this historical study, we are going to come back to the moment now, and in the third part of this video, we are going to look at the planetary energies for 2020. Personally, I think that this year is still going to be very conflictive, especially when Mars goes into Aries. But the purpose of this study is going to be to extract out of these planetary energies its most positive potential. Let us not forget that while astrology gives us the information on what the planetary energies are, it depends only on us, human beings, how we use this energy, because we have freedom and free will. So without further delay, let us begin with the video, and I hope you find it very interesting. Let us begin with the eclipse that happened on the 26th of December 2019. Solar eclipses are known to bring about important events for humanity. Depending on its intensity and on the planetary configuration around it, the effect of a solar eclipse could last between 6 and 18 months. But what is the symbolism of a solar eclipse? A solar eclipse portrays a moment of darkness, in which the light that dominates in the sky and gives life to everything that exists on Earth is temporarily extinguished. This symbolism carries with it a connotation of end, the ending of a chapter of existence before the beginning of a new one. This moment of pause, in which everything is contained in a latent state of silence, holds within itself the seed of what is to come. The quality of this seed can be observed in the astrological chart that surrounds the eclipse, and the eclipse that occurred on December 26, 2019 contains a very powerful astrological configuration. Interestingly, the existence of the coronavirus was publicly disclosed on December 31st, on a very near date to the solar eclipse. Thus, the correspondence between the macrocosm and the microcosm was reflected on this event, as the Hermetic principle says, as above, so below. Let us now look at the different components of this significant eclipse. First of all, the eclipse happened in Capricorn, and if eclipses already denote endings, Capricorn emphasizes even more this notion of end. This is because Capricorn is ruled by Saturn, a planet that was traditionally associated with limits and endings. In second place, this eclipse was in close conjunction to Jupiter, the planet of greatness and expansion. However, Jupiter in Capricorn is in fall, which means that out of this eclipse, probably there is going to come out the expansion of something that is unfavorable. In third place, this eclipse was making an aspect of trine to Uranus in Taurus. Uranus is the planet of innovation, but also of radical and unforeseen changes. So out of this eclipse, we could see in the next few months radical and unforeseen changes in the areas of economy, ecology, and medicine, all pertaining to Taurus. It is also significant that just a few days after this eclipse, the powerful Saturn-Pluto conjunction in Capricorn also took place. As we will see later, this conjunction entails important economic, political, and social crises, as well as an emphasis on the symbolism of transformation and death, which is associated to both planets. Finally, it is essential to highlight the position of Neptune in Pisces. Neptune is a planet associated with spirituality, but also because of its intangible and invisible nature, it is related to viruses and all kinds of diseases that are difficult to detect. Moreover, the sign of Pisces is related to the unlimited. Therefore, we could associate the coronavirus and its exponential, invisible, and quick expansion to the position of Neptune in Pisces. While a solar eclipse contains the seed of what is to come during the next 6 to 18 months, the following lunar eclipse, which takes place 14 days after the solar eclipse, shows what the impact of that seed will be on humanity during those months. It is known that a full moon has a powerful influence on the survival instincts and the behaviors of the masses of people. These behaviors are even more enhanced during a lunar eclipse. During the lunar eclipse on the 10th of January, the moon was in its own sign of Cancer. A full moon in Cancer represents, more than any other one, the population at a great scale. Also, the moon was making aspects of opposition to Saturn, Pluto, and Mercury in Capricorn, and a trine to Neptune in Pisces. Let us look at the meaning of these aspects. The trine between the moon and Neptune is an aspect that shows fluidity, and somehow it represents the rapid and invisible expansion that the virus is going to have on the population during the months following this lunar eclipse. The opposition between the moon and Saturn, a planet that symbolizes limits and that is very strongly located in its own sign of Capricorn, represents the need to establish boundaries between people in order to contain the virus. These boundaries have progressively hardened from the use of face masks and gloves to the 1 meter distance between people to the confinement of the population in their homes, separated by walls. The opposition from the moon to the stellium formed by Mercury, Pluto, and Saturn in Capricorn as a whole is indicative of the restrictions on the commercial activity on the one hand, and on the other hand, it also represents the compulsive need to buy food and essential items for survival. On a deeper level, the opposition between the moon and Saturn and Pluto represents the fear of death that can spread amongst the population, and also the deep emotional crisis that this difficult situation is bringing along. However, this opposition also holds the potential to transform through the energy of Pluto this situation and to slow it down or even stop it through the energy of Saturn. The trine between the Moon and Neptune, a planet that symbolizes spirituality and transcendence, also contains a very powerful positive potential. The possibility of a new spiritual awakening during this time of crisis, an awakening perhaps towards a more humane scale of values, a connection with the soul, and the alignment with the divine. Every 36 years, approximately, a conjunction between Saturn and Pluto takes place. This conjunction is highly significant because Pluto brings the transformation of the Saturnian collective structures that have been built over long periods of time. Moreover, both planets carry a symbolism of death and crisis, which characterizes this period of collective transformation. We must understand that the conjunction is the moment of a new beginning, which contains the energy of both planets combined. Within the 36 years of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, there are three other significant moments. The first square, which takes place approximately 9 years after the conjunction. The opposition, which occurs in the middle of the cycle, around 18 years after the conjunction. And the last square, which happens 27 years after the conjunction. Then, after those aspects, the next conjunction takes place and a new cycle begins. All these moments within the Saturn-Pluto cycle contain great tension that usually triggers events of major impact on humanity. To fully comprehend the nature of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, let us first revise the symbolism of both planets separately. Saturn was the most distant of planets known in ancient times. Due to its slow movement, it was associated with time, experience, and knowledge. Given that Saturn was the furthest of planets observable with the naked eye, it entailed the limit of the known universe, and therefore it also represented death and the afterlife. In Greek mythology, the planet Saturn was associated with the god Kronos, who was the king of heaven during the golden age of the gods, a time when humanity lived in perfect order and harmony. However, Kronos was a tyrant god who, for fear of being overthrown, used to eat each of his children as soon as they were born. Centuries later, with the invention of the telescope, astrologers were able to observe the beautiful rings of Saturn, which had a perfect circular shape. This resonated with the symbolism of limit, order, and perfection that had been attributed to this planet. In astrological terms, Saturn symbolizes limits and death, as well as order, collective structures, and traditions maintained throughout time. In its positive form, it represents seriousness, responsibility, strategy, and commitment. However, in its adverse form, it entails rigidity, coldness, and severity. Saturn is currently strengthened in Capricorn, its own sign of rulership. Saturn in Capricorn represents the political, economic, and legal structures of society, as well as the large organizations, companies, and institutional systems that have been maintained throughout time. Pluto was discovered in 1930, during a dark time of economic crisis between the two world wars. This was a time when nuclear power was being discovered, organized crime had gained great influence, and totalitarian systems were rising. On its positive side, this was also a time when many theories about psychology and the unconscious were being developed. All of these themes resonate with the vibration of Pluto. In Greek mythology, Hades, which was later called Pluto, was the god of the underworld and the ruler of the dead. He carried a pitchfork with which he could cause earthquakes, as well as a helmet of invisibility. He reigned with his wife Persephone, who he had kidnapped and forced to accompany him in the government of the underworld. In astrological terms, Pluto symbolizes death, existential crisis, and the encounter with the unknown. In its negative form, it represents manipulation, cruelty, secrecy, and abuse of power. While in its positive side, it portrays the ability to see beyond the physical, to penetrate into the depth of the unknown, and to experience rebirth after a process of cathartic transformation. Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008, when a global economic crisis occurred. Since then, while transiting through Capricorn, Pluto has, like an active earthquake, caused many fragmentations in the political, economic, and social systems. So, once we have studied the symbolism of both planets, what can we expect then out of the conjunction that is taking place now? If on one hand Pluto means destruction, and on the other hand Saturn means structure, we can expect earthquakes on the political and financial systems characteristic of Capricorn. Inexorably, Pluto is going to destroy all the structures that are not firm enough to stay upright. We can expect a global economic crisis that could put the strain on governments and world organizations. But also Capricorn, as an earth sign, is related to health and medicine, especially to the established and practical knowledge of this science. Therefore, it is not surprising that this conjunction in Capricorn is bringing such a huge crisis in the area of public health. Let us observe that together with these planets, the Sun and Mercury are also part of this conjunction. The Sun, on the one hand, is the symbol of life and light. However, this life is being diminished by the presence of Saturn and Pluto. We could literally read this as life coming to an end. However, on the other hand, Mercury, which is located between Saturn and Pluto and the Sun, is playing a very important role of intermediation between life and death. Mercury was the Greek god Hermes, who used to carry a caduceus, the symbol of medicine. Therefore, Mercury somehow represents the role of nurses and doctors who are fighting between life and death to save the life of the people affected by the coronavirus. It is important to understand that we are at the beginning of the cycle between Saturn and Pluto. This means that even though the health crisis could be reduced over the next 18 months, the restructuring of the health, economic, and political systems will be a process of slow recovery that will last the entire cycle. Let us now take a look at certain moments in history in which the Saturn-Pluto cycle has brought about important events for humanity. From historical records, we have evidence of the main pandemics that have occurred in humanity. Even though it is not possible to know the exact moment in which the viruses that caused those pandemics arose, what is significant in astrological terms is that the times when most deaths have been recorded in history coincide with significant moments of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, especially with the conjunctions. And in many cases, they also coincide with powerful eclipses on the Capricorn-Cancer axis. This is a situation that astrologically resonates with the one that we are experiencing now in 2020. Let us now study some of these examples in history. During the time of the Byzantine Empire, one of the greatest epidemics in history took place, the Great Plague of Justinian, due to which around 40 million people died in Asia, Africa, and Europe. As a preamble to this pandemic, in the year 539, several solar and lunar eclipses took place in the sign of Capricorn, in conjunction and in opposition to Pluto. This is an astrological configuration that resonates very much with the one that we have now in 2020. Also, Neptune was in the sign of Pisces, like it is today. In that occasion, it was in conjunction to Jupiter, which increased the expansion of the pandemic. It is worth noting that during the most critical time of this pandemic, in the year 540, there was a square between Saturn and Pluto. The end of the 13th century was a period of crisis brought about mainly by a climate change. This was a time of transition between the medieval warm period and the medieval ice age. At the same time, this was a period in which Europe was going through a process of economic, political, and social restructure, which had been generated by the great increase in population. We can only imagine the chaotic and fragmentary process of disintegration of the feudal systems that had been dominating in Europe up until that time. In these feudal systems, a lord ruled over the surrounding fields and over the farmers who were his vassals. These pyramidal systems were disintegrating at the same time as the new cities were being built on a much larger scale and with new laws that had to respond to a much more complex society and economy. This is a situation that greatly resonates with the current one of the 21st century, in which the laws and political structures of the different nations are faced with the much more complex reality of the global world. It is worth noting that at that time, specifically in the year 1284, there was a Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the sign of Capricorn, as well as a solar eclipse in the same sign, something that astrologically completely resonates with the actual situation in 2020. However, at that time, there were not any major pandemics, and this is probably due to the fact that Neptune, the planet that represents viruses and illnesses, was in the sign of Virgo, the opposite sign of Pisces, where it is today. To me, it is quite significant that the Pope Innocent III had earlier predicted that the world would end on that year, in 1284, the year in which the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto was taking place. However, this Pope could not know about this conjunction because Pluto had not yet been discovered. The end of the world did not happen literally at that time, but that conjunction did bring about the end of the known structures as well as the emergence of a new order. A symbol of this new order were the Gothic cathedrals. These great structures, made in stone, reflect the conjunction of Saturn, which represents structure, and Pluto, which represents power, in Capricorn, a zodiac sign associated with minerals and stones. The following Saturn-Pluto conjunction in the year 1318 was more severe. This conjunction coincided with a time of great famine in Europe, as well as with a time in which the temperatures were very cold. This epoch has even been called the Little Ice Age. During that time, the cold temperatures had devastating consequences on the crops and the cattle. Mortality spread and the population began to decrease. This Saturn-Pluto conjunction brought with it a time of economic chaos and great losses. At the same time, several eclipses occurred next to these two planets in the sign of Pisces. These powerful eclipses aggravated the major disturbances that occurred in all levels of existence, with cannibalism being the most devastating and negative reflection of this astrological configuration. The Sun was next to Saturn and Pluto during that conjunction, and this, again, reflects the loss of life as well as the decrease in population that era brought along. The sign of Pisces, in which this conjunction took place, shows on the one hand the new seed of diseases that were starting to spread, and on the other hand, it also shows the religious crisis that was emerging at that time. This religious crisis was due to a general loss of faith and mistrust of the Church. The two previous Saturn-Pluto conjunctions were the preamble to the most devastating pandemic that humanity has suffered, the Black Death. This occurred at the same time as the next Saturn-Pluto conjunction was taking place in the sign of Aries in the year 1350. The symbolism of Pluto and Saturn, associated with death, darkness, crisis, chaos, and destruction, reached its maximum expression at this time. It is estimated that between 70 and 200 million people died in Asia, Europe, and Africa. This meant a very drastic decrease in almost half of the population, while the Saturn-Pluto conjunction was taking place in the year 1350. This Saturn-Pluto conjunction, due to retrograde movements, lasted about 2 years, at the same time as the peak of mortality, and while several solar and lunar eclipses on the Cancer-Capricorn axis square this conjunction. Again, this resonates astrologically with the current situation. Another remarkable resonance is given by the position of Uranus in Taurus, the same position as it is today. Uranus here shows the radical and unforeseen changes that this pandemic brought in the areas of health and economy. But it also shows the medical advances that were being developed at that time in order to fight this pandemic. These medical advances were the basis of modern medicine. Uranus in Taurus somehow also shows the rebalancing between climate, demography, and the use of natural resources that was taking place at that time. This is something that we are also witnessing today. Unlike the current situation, however, let us point out that probably the drastic mortality that happened during the Black Death is due to the fact that this conjunction took place in the sign of Aries. Aries, because it's ruled by the planet Mars, can be a very destructive and aggressive sign. But also, Saturn in Aries is in fall, which means that it is more difficult for it to slow down or to put limits to the pandemic. Let us now take a leap towards the 19th century, to a time in which another one of the largest pandemics that humanity has faced emerged, the cholera. The 19th century was marked by the emergence of the cholera epidemic, which spread from India to all the continents throughout the whole century. The initial outbreak occurred between 1817 and 1824, coinciding with the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in the sign of Pisces. It is interesting to note that Pisces is a water sign, and the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto that took place in this sign was also making trine aspects to the Moon and Mars located in Scorpio and Cancer, which are also water signs. This somehow reflects the way in which the cholera was spread through the intake of non-drinkable water. It is also worth noting the square aspects from this conjunction to the planets Neptune, Uranus, and Mercury located in the sign of Sagittarius. This is a sign that is associated with great distances, and this somehow also reflects the way in which this epidemic expanded throughout the whole world through commerce and migration movements. The cholera disease continued to spread during the 19th century through different outbreaks, but it is worth pointing out the peak of mortality that occurred with the next Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1852. This conjunction took place in the sign of Aries, and as we saw before, the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto in Aries is especially negative because Saturn is in fall and it finds it difficult to put limits to the expansion of the pandemic. It is also interesting that during this conjunction there was another great trine in water signs, in this occasion formed by the planets Jupiter, Mars, and Venus. This great trine also symbolizes how the disease kept spreading through the intake of unhealthy water. Lastly, let us point out the positions of Neptune in Pisces and Uranus in Taurus, which hold astrological resonance with the positions of today in 2020. Let us go now to the 20th century to study the Saturn-Pluto conjunctions that have taken place recently. In the year 1914, coinciding with the beginning of the First World War, there was another Saturn-Pluto conjunction, this time in the sign of Cancer. Cancer is a zodiac sign that represents nationalism and patriotism. Therefore, it is not surprising that the conjunction of these two planets resulted in a war between nations, in which 17 million people died. The full moon that took place during this conjunction, with the Sun in Libra and the Moon in Aries, highlights the duality of the conflict and war. It is also significant the trine from Saturn and Pluto to Mars, the planet of war, which was located in the destructive sign of Scorpio. The devastating consequences of the First World War were not only the dramatic loss of human lives, but also the disabilities and amputations with which millions of soldiers had to live thereafter, as well as the deterioration of the economy, the profusion of hunger, and the spread of diseases. Still under the influence of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction that happened in 1914, in the year 1918, there was another one of the largest pandemics that humanity has suffered, the Spanish flu. This pandemic was triggered by a series of solar and lunar eclipses that took place in the Cancer-Capricorn axis, in conjunction and in opposition to Pluto. The Spanish flu was one of the most devastating pandemics in history. Due to this pandemic, which affected the entire world, in the space of only 2 years, between 50 and 100 million people died. Within the same cycle that had begun in the year 1914 with the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto, a critical point was reached when these two planets made a square in the year 1939. This was the year when the Second World War started, and somehow the seed of conflict that had begun with the conjunction resurfaced here with more intensity and tension. Many historians consider both wars as part of the same international conflict, and this is confirmed by astrology, since both wars are clearly part of the same Saturn-Pluto cycle. The position of Pluto in the fixed sign of Leo reflects the totalitarian and absolutist power that prevailed in the German side, while Saturn in Taurus, also a fixed sign, somehow shows the position of resistance. Among the devastating consequences of the Second World War were the massacres, genocides, and bombs, which left more than 75 million dead people, as well as cities in ruins, proliferation of diseases, and hunger. The following Saturn-Pluto conjunction that took place in 1947 carried with it another dramatic period in the history of humanity. On the one hand, this conjunction meant the end of the two previous wars, but on the other hand, it opened the door to the new power of the nuclear weapons of mass destruction. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs that occurred in 1945 were the preamble to the Saturn-Pluto conjunction in 1947, which took place at the height of nuclear research. The conjunction of these planets in the fire sign of Leo, and in conjunction with the Sun, which is a symbol of energy, shows the devastating and explosive power of this astrological configuration. Consequences of the bombs that took place between 1945 and 1949 were the deaths of more than 200,000 people, to which we must sadly add the following deaths and physical deformations of the people and the children born in the affected areas. The next Saturn-Pluto conjunction that happened in year 1982 carried with it a time of economic recession as well as the emergence of the new AIDS epidemic. The sign of Libra in which this conjunction took place is a symbol of both commercial agreements and personal relationships, all of which was deeply affected by this conjunction and the emergence of the new virus. It is worth noting that during this conjunction there were numerous planets located in the sign of Scorpio, a sign that symbolizes the hidden worlds, and it also symbolizes sexuality and addictions. Somehow this reflects the way in which the virus expanded through sexual relationships, and it also shows the widespread use of new drugs that was starting to happen at that time. That year, there were also several eclipses in the Cancer-Capricorn axis that were squaring Saturn and Pluto, and this increased the negative effect of this conjunction. As we can see in this graph, the initial outbreak of AIDS coincided with the Saturn-Pluto conjunction of 1982. But not only AIDS characterized this era, also the rise of organized crime and international drug gangs, all of which is distinctive of the Saturn-Pluto conjunction and the stellium of planets in Scorpio. When the cycle of Saturn and Pluto that had begun in the year 1982 reached its midpoint with the opposition between these two planets in the year 2001, a point of maximum tension occurred which coincided with the Twin Towers attack in New York. During this opposition, Mars, the planet of war and destruction, was next to Pluto in the sign of Sagittarius. Sagittarius is a fire sign that also represents the large distances. Somehow, this configuration shows the way in which this attack on the towers happened through commercial aircraft. On the other side of the opposition, Saturn in Gemini could literally be read as twin structures or twin towers. That year, there were also several eclipses in the Cancer-Capricorn axis. Now that we have gone through the historical review of the Saturn-Pluto cycle, let us come back to 2020 to study the current planetary configuration from a broader perspective. As we have seen in the previous examples, the conjunction of Saturn and Pluto is very powerful and can have dramatic consequences on humanity. In addition to death and destruction, the conjunction in Capricorn can bring the collapse of the economic and political systems, as well as abuse of power, organized crime, and authoritarian regimes. In its positive aspect, however, this conjunction calls for the elimination of corruption, the transformation of political structures, and the establishment of new laws that can bring a more harmonious collective order. Likewise, although this conjunction can bring disruptions in the economic system, it also contains the potential of a whole regeneration of the economic system based on a stronger foundation. This will be especially favorable while Jupiter transits through Capricorn during this year. Regarding the health crisis, Saturn, located in its own sign of Capricorn, can succeed in the containment of the virus, especially if the restrictions of distancing and confinement are followed, although this could be a slow process. Another tragic and at the same time powerfully symbolic event that the current Saturn-Pluto conjunction has brought about has been the fire of the Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, which happened last year. The fall of this religious and spiritual structure perhaps was an indicative sign that something unfortunate was about to happen on the earth. Let us note that when this fire happened on the 15th of April of 2019, the two planets were already in very close conjunction between 20 and 23 degrees of Capricorn. Also, let us observe that the fire was triggered by the position of the Sun in the fire sign of Aries, which was making a square to both Saturn and Pluto in Capricorn. But let's go back in time to highlight the interesting fact that some historians date the completion of this cathedral on the year 1285. This was just a few months after another conjunction of Saturn and Pluto had taken place at 26 degrees of Capricorn, in almost the same exact position as the current conjunction that we have now in the sky. The conjunction in the year 1284 brought with it the highest point of medieval times, a culmination that was reflected in the construction of Notre-Dame, the most representative of the Gothic cathedrals. Now, more than 700 years later, the current conjunction has brought with it the fall of this symbol that has deep religious and spiritual significance for humanity. The synchronicity of these conjunctions is not coincidence, but the confirmation that cosmic cycles bring about chain events in the world. Clearly, this recent event that happened in the Notre-Dame Cathedral highlights the fact that we live under the laws of a time that is not linear but cyclical. Let us now take a look at the positions of the different planets throughout the year 2020. Mars went into Capricorn in mid-February. Since then, the intervention of the police and the military systems has intensified in many countries as a means of maintaining the collective order during this health crisis. It is to be expected that when Mars conjuncts Pluto and Saturn by the end of March and beginning of April, that the restrictions will increase. This could provoke some social conflict, especially while Mars transits through the sign of Aquarius until mid-May. Then, when Mars goes into Pisces until the end of June, the coronavirus could reach a peak. But it is also possible that during this time, an effective vaccine could be found, especially when Mars conjuncts Neptune around the second week of June. It is very interesting the full moon that will happen in June, which emphasizes very much this position of Mars and perhaps reflects some kind of commercial or international conflict regarding a vaccine or some other cure for this virus. But the most intense period of Mars will happen when this planet goes into Aries, its own sign of rulership, by the end of June. And it is going to stay in this sign for more than 6 months until the beginning of January 2021. Mars in Aries is going to activate the energy of conflict, and this conflict could be especially intense when Mars squares Pluto between the months of August and December. The new moons that will take place in August and in October highlight this position of Mars, and they could also trigger the combined energies of Saturn, Pluto, and Mars, and bring with it some commercial confrontation or some warlike conflict. These energies can be very explosive, and we can only hope that they are handled with consciousness, to resolve conflicts rather than to aggravate them, or, in its most hopeful version, to reach some kind of peace agreement as the new moon in Libra of October indicates. Otherwise, the conflict could escalate and reach more tension in January and February of 2021. Jupiter entered Capricorn in December 2019 and is going to be in this sign until the end of December 2020. The movement of Jupiter could be indicative of how the coronavirus expands. At this moment in time, in April 2020, with the conjunction of Jupiter and Pluto, we are witnessing a large expansion of the pandemic. However, during the summer months, when Jupiter is in retrograde movement, the pandemic could reduce. Then, after mid-September, when Jupiter goes into direct movement again, the pandemic could start to expand again and reach a critical point around November when Jupiter makes the third conjunction with Pluto. Also, the new moon that will happen in November in Scorpio will be making aspects to both Jupiter and Pluto, and this emphasizes the possibility that there could be more expansion of the coronavirus around that time. Regarding the financial systems, the conjunctions of Jupiter and Pluto in Capricorn that we are going to experience during the next few months could bring a great deal of instability. However, let us not forget that Jupiter is the planet of abundance, and these conjunctions with Pluto contain a great positive potential of regenerating the economy according to a strong and a well-constructed foundation that could bring practical results in the long term, as the energy of Capricorn in which this conjunction takes place indicates. When Jupiter conjuncts Saturn at 0 degrees of Aquarius, by the end of December 2020, we could see some scientific or technological advance, perhaps some preventive tests that might be used to reduce the progression of the pandemic during the months following this conjunction. Saturn will spend this year transiting through the two signs of its own rulership, Capricorn and Aquarius. Its transit through Capricorn is bringing with it very strong measures, such as the implementation of new restrictive laws, the imposition of physical limits between people, or the hardening of the borders between countries. The restrictions that we are experiencing this year, like the lockdown, the confinement, or the stopping of our normal activities, are all very characteristic of Saturn in Capricorn. Now, given this situation, we may ask ourselves, how can we use this energy in its most positive way? Saturn, the Great Master, in the sign of Capricorn, invites us to enter a space of silence and reflection, to observe our lives with objectivity in order to extract what is most essential and valuable. Likewise, Saturn in Capricorn invites us to look to the past, to our history, whether on an individual or collective level, to gain knowledge from past experiences that could be useful both to the present situation and to the creation of a better future. The transit of Saturn through Aquarius between March and July, and then from mid-December until 2023, will be characterized by a social restructuring through the implementation of new technologies, the emergence of important scientific discoveries, and also through an increase of professional activity through the internet and social events that could take place online. This year, this will all be especially favorable around the new moon of May, which will be in Gemini, because this moon will be making a trine aspect to Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn in Aquarius can also symbolize the implementation by the governments of geolocation technologies in order to track the movement of the population as a way of containing the virus. The eclipse that will happen on the 21st of June shows, by the quincunx aspect to Saturn in Aquarius, that a great part of the population could perceive this control of the technologies with a certain degree of discomfort, perhaps as a deprivation of their freedom. The eclipse of the 21st of June will be another important eclipse that will happen right on the day of the summer solstice, at 0 degrees of Cancer. This is a critical point of the zodiac in which the sun, once it has reached its highest point in the sky, begins to descend, and the days begin to be shorter. For this reason, the symbolism of end and darkness that surrounds the eclipses is here more emphasized. Mainly, this eclipse represents an end and a new beginning for much of the population, who during the months after the eclipse will have to face personal losses as well as new ways of living, both economically and socially. After this eclipse, the following new moon in July, which will take place at 28 degrees of Cancer, will be in exact opposition to Saturn in Capricorn. Somehow, this continues to show difficulties and tension between the population and the governments, which will probably keep imposing restrictive measures in the economy, in the commercial activities, and also in the movement of people. Uranus entered Taurus in 2019 and is going to remain in this sign until 2025. Uranus is a planet that symbolizes both drastic changes as well as technological innovations. And during these years, Uranus is going to shake up the field of economy, ecology, and medicine, as well as fashion and art, and all of those areas pertaining to Taurus. But mainly, as we have seen in previous examples, Uranus in Taurus calls for a readjustment between climate, demography, and the use of natural resources of the Earth. This readjustment could require very strong Uranian shake-ups for it to find a new balance. Some of the drastic changes that Uranus in Taurus may bring along could be a new economy based on a virtual currency, as well as important scientific discoveries in the fields of medicine or in the area of ecology and renewable energies. The Uranian shake-ups will be especially active in 2020 and also in 2021. This is because a square aspect is being built up between Saturn and Uranus. This aspect could intensify the economic crisis and also bring along some social revolts or struggles against the established order if it is too restrictive. This will be especially noticeable around the new moon of April, which is in conjunction to Uranus and square to Saturn. Also, the full moons of August and at the end of October, they mark very strong tension aspects to Uranus, which could enhance its revolutionary energy. On its positive side, Uranus in Taurus can bring along innovations in the area of health or new medicines that can help to fight or treat the coronavirus. This will be especially significant around the full moons of September and February 2021, which will be located in the Virgo-Pisces axis and making favorable aspects to Uranus in Taurus. However, in September, because Uranus is in retrograde movement, perhaps these medicines are still in a process of trial and error. And then, when Uranus goes direct again, after January 2021, perhaps these medicines reach more definite results. Uranus in Taurus calls us for a radical change in the scale of values at a collective level that highlights the importance of health, ecology, and nature. In its most positive potential, the years of Uranus in Taurus can bring an increase in ecological awareness, both on a small and a large scale, that includes every aspect from the produce of organic food to the design of green and sustainable cities. Pluto entered Capricorn in 2008 and will remain in this sign until 2024. In 2008, with the entrance of Pluto in Capricorn, we witnessed the downfall of Lehman Brothers, which brought along the beginning of the economic crisis that we are still experiencing now. Since 2008, we have seen commotions in the economy and fractures in the political systems. And this situation has somehow been aggravated since 2018 with the entrance of Saturn in Capricorn as well, and moreover in 2020 with the conjunction of both planets in this sign. As we have seen in previous examples, the action of Pluto is inexorable, so we must accept the downfalls of systems that no longer fulfill the requirements of the planet or of humanity. The energy of Pluto will continue to be very active this year, bringing along existential crises as well as economic and political fragmentations. In its worst version, it can also bring abuse of power, destruction, war, and death. These Plutonian energies could be especially felt around the end of the year with the solar eclipse of December, and even more so with the new moon of January 2021, which will be in conjunction to Pluto, and this will activate very powerfully the Plutonian energy. Although it is a hard process, the purpose of Pluto in Capricorn is to regenerate and purify the political and economic structures in order to create from its remainings new ones that are in harmony with the order of the universe. Pluto calls us, individually and collectively, to a transformation of our ways of life, to live in harmony with the planet. The cathartic processes of Pluto in Capricorn can generate, at its maximum positive potential, a healing of the planet and of humanity. Neptune entered Pisces, its own sign of rulership, in 2012 and is gonna keep traveling through this sign until 2026. As we saw at the beginning of this video, Neptune in Pisces, because of its invisible and unlimited quality, can be related to all kinds of viruses or diseases that are difficult to detect. However, it can also be associated with higher consciousness and spirituality. When we attune, either by prayer or by meditation, with the higher power of the divine, when we align with God, we can heal the mind and thus, to a large extent, any kind of disease. We humans are beings of light living in physical bodies. Therefore, when we open the door to the light of our spiritual being, every cell in our body is nourished with renewed energy. Thus, Neptune in Pisces is a getaway to the highest dimension of the divine light, from where we can reestablish the balance between the body, the soul, and the spirit. During the times of isolation imposed by Saturn in Capricorn, Neptune in Pisces calls us to the understanding that we are all connected in an emotional and in a spiritual levels. For example, when we meditate, we can feel the presence of our loved ones within us. Likewise, when we enter the spiritual dimension, we can feel that we are part of the whole of humanity. Finally, it is interesting to note that the coronavirus contains, in its name, the same word as the upper chakra of higher consciousness, the chakra called corona. Furthermore, in the Kabbalistic tradition, the superior sephira of the Tree of Life, which is associated with the planet Neptune, is called Keter, which also means crown or corona. From this sephira emanates the divine light from which all human beings originally were created. Therefore, ultimately, this situation of actual crisis calls us to the awakening of this higher consciousness and to the realization that we are all one. I hope you found this video interesting, and if so, please share it. Lastly, I would like to share with you that since the year 2010, I fully dedicate myself to astrology and spirituality, which are my great passions. I do most of my work on a donation basis, and all donations go a long way towards helping me to continue with astrological research, articles, and videos. If you would like to contribute with my work, you can do so on my website or by following the link below this video. All donations are received wholeheartedly with full appreciation and gratitude. Thank you so much for watching. Love and best wishes to you.